Tonight, we tell the story of a knight so skilled in battle that kings begged for his service, yet history nearly erased him. William Marshal wasn't just any warrior. He survived 5 kings, fought in hundreds of battles, and somehow died peacefully in his bed at 72. How did this man, born landless and unimportant, become England's greatest knight? Put on your pajamas, turn down the lights, and let me tell you about the one warrior even death couldn't claim in combat. Most 5-year-olds worry about scraped knees or lost toys. William Marshal worried about the noose. His father handed him over as a hostage to King Stephen in 1152, standard practice for noble families wanting to prove their loyalty. It was medieval deal-making 101, surrender your child, keep your lands. Until his father broke the agreement. The king didn't hesitate. He dragged young William to the hanging tree where executioners waited. Contemporary sources say the boy thought they were playing a game at first. He asked if he could ride the heavy wooden beam like a horse. The king's men actually tied the rope around his neck before someone talked Stephen down. Apparently, even medieval monarchs had limits when it came to executing children. Hostage-taking wasn't rare. Noble families treated kids like human collateral. Richard the Lionheart spent years as a royal prisoner in Germany after his crusade. Eleanor of Aquitaine's granddaughter spent her teens locked in Bristol Castle as political insurance. What made William's case different was his father's willingness to sacrifice him. Most noble parents at least pretended to care. William's dad, John Marshal, was playing the long game. He'd switched sides in England's Civil War, figuring the boy meant less than keeping his lands. The family chronicle claims the king couldn't go through with the hanging because the child amused him. More likely, Stephen realized a dead 5-year-old made terrible PR even in the 12th century. The boy spent months in the king's custody, moving between castles with the royal court. He learned early that powerful men could change their minds about killing you at any moment. That experience stuck. Later in life, William avoided absolute loyalty to any single ruler. He survived 5 kings by always keeping an exit strategy. Medieval childhoods were brutal even without execution attempts. Noble kids faced arranged marriages at 12, military training at 7, and constant threats from rival families. The average life expectancy for boys in William's class was about 35, if they survived childhood diseases and training accidents. William outlived most of his peers by watching how adults behaved around power. His father's gamble worked, by the way. The land stayed in the family. Young William eventually returned home, chewed-up ropes still around his neck according to some stories. The experience taught him 3 lessons. Everyone negotiates. No alliance lasts forever. And sometimes you survive because you're not worth killing yet. The next 10 years disappear from records. When William resurfaces, he's being sent to train with a cousin in Normandy. This was typical. Noble families farmed out boys to relatives for military education. William probably learned to ride in armor before he hit puberty. His training focused on practical skills over chivalric ideals. After all, this was the kid who almost swung from a rope because of his father's bad political instincts. What's remarkable isn't that William got handed over. It's that he didn't turn into a complete psychopath afterward. Most medieval nobles who survived traumatic childhoods became either religious fanatics or sadistic warlords. William developed something more dangerous: cold calculation. He'd remember that hanging tree every time he stood before a king for the rest of his life. The episode also explains why he later became obsessed with building his own family's security. Having nearly died because his father lacked lands to ransom him, William spent decades acquiring property and titles. That scrappy hostage kid would eventually control more territory than the king, who almost hung him. Not bad for someone who started life as expendable political currency. Modern historians debate whether the hanging story got exaggerated over time. But even if the rope never touched his neck, the psychological impact was real. William spent his entire career avoiding situations where someone else controlled his fate. Every alliance, every battle, every political move kept him from ever becoming someone's hostage again. That 5-year-old at the hanging tree would become the only medieval knight to defeat Richard the Lionheart in combat, outmaneuver King John, and die peacefully in his bed draped in Templar robes. Not because he was the strongest or cleverest, but because he understood early how power really worked. The greatest knight in England earned his first lesson at age 5. Survival isn't about strength. It's about knowing when to bow and when to slip the noose. William Marshal had a problem most young knights understood all too well. No land meant no income. While his older brother inherited the family estate, William got a sword and a horse. That's where tournaments came in. Forget the colorful just you've seen in movies. These were brutal team brawls where the real prize wasn't glory, it was ransom money. Picture two groups of armored men charging at each other across a field. Their goal was simple: capture as many opposing knights as possible. Each prisoner meant a payday. Top knights could demand hundreds of pounds for a high-status captive, enough to live on for years. The records show William and his partner Roger de Gougy once took so many prisoners they needed a separate ledger to track ransom payments. Most knights died broke despite competing. The casualty rates were staggering. Broken bones, concussions, and the occasional lance through the eye socket were just part of the game. One chronicle describes a tournament where so many horses were killed the field looked like a butcher's yard. William had an edge though. He never got seriously injured. His worst mishap was getting knocked unconscious once. He woke up with a headache and went right back to fighting the next day. The economics worked like this. A captured knight would negotiate his release price on the spot. Nobles paid more, common knights less. William specialized in identifying the richest targets in the chaos of battle. He reportedly had a knack for spotting expensive armor and heraldic symbols in the melee. His biographer claims he captured 103 knights in one season alone. At an average ransom of £20 each, that's over £2,000, enough to buy several small estates. What set William apart wasn't just his fighting skill. He pioneered a business model. Most knights competed randomly, hoping to get lucky. William formed dedicated tournament teams that worked like medieval special forces. They'd coordinate attacks, share intelligence on valuable targets, and split the profits. His squad became so dominant that other knights sometimes paid protection money just to avoid being captured. The ransom system had its own rules. You couldn't demand more than a captive could reasonably pay. That would ruin your reputation. But you could negotiate alternative payments. Horses, armor, even future favors were common currencies. William once accepted a prized warhorse instead of cash from a cash-strapped count. That horse later became legendary in its own right. Tournaments weren't just about money, though. They were networking events where ambitious knights could catch the eye of powerful patrons. William's consistent wins earned him invitations to royal courts across Europe. French chronicles mention King Louis VII kept asking who this English devil was who kept winning everything. William's secret weapon was psychological. He realized most knights fought for honor and reckless glory. He fought to control the battlefield. His signature move was feigning retreat to lure opponents into traps. While others chased individual glory, William's team worked together to isolate and capture high-value targets. It wasn't chivalrous, but it paid the bills. The money changed everything. By his late 20s, William could afford his own retinue of knights. He bought land in Normandy despite having no official title to it yet. Most importantly, he gained something priceless: independence. Unlike most knights who relied on handouts from lords, William answered to no one. When King Henry II's son young Henry needed a tournament champion, he had to negotiate terms with William like any other business deal. The tournament circuit also taught William survival skills beyond combat. He learned to read people quickly, spotting bluffs and ransom negotiations. He mastered logistics, moving his team across borders with their growing collection of horses and prisoners. Most crucially, he understood that reputation mattered more than bravery. Being known as invincible meant opponents sometimes surrendered without a fight. This period reveals a key lesson about medieval society. Land was power, but cash was freedom. William used his tournament earnings to buy time until proper land grants came through. When they finally did, he was already richer than most established nobles. The boy who'd grown up landless now had options. He could turn down bad offers from kings because he didn't need their handouts. The records show William's tournament career lasted about 15 years. He quit while ahead, retiring from the circuit when the political rewards outweighed the financial ones. But those years shaped him profoundly. The same calculation that helped him spot valuable targets in a melee later helped him navigate royal courts. And the money? It became the foundation for everything that followed. The lands, the titles, the power. All because he realized early that in a world of inherited privilege, sometimes you just need to take things for yourself. One of his captured knights later wrote that fighting William felt like being hunted rather than challenged. That's probably the best summary of his tournament strategy. While others played at chivalry, William treated combat like a balance sheet. Every move calculated, every risk measured. It wasn't pretty, but neither was dying poor in a ditch somewhere. William preferred counting coins to counting his wounds. Most knights avoided royal family drama like the plague. But in 1173, William Marshal found himself staring down the ultimate career gamble, choosing between King Henry II and his rebellious teenage son, Henry the Young King. This wasn't just some petty squabble. The Angevin family ruled England and half of France, and their civil wars could make or break a knight's entire future. The setup was messy. Young Henry, though crowned as co-king at 15, had no real power. His father kept control of everything: the money, the armies, even the castles. So the kid did what any spoiled medieval prince would do. He rebelled with backing from France. Half the English nobility joined him, smelling opportunity. The other half stuck with Dad. William had to pick a side, knowing the wrong choice could mean exile or execution. Other knights weren't so careful. Robert de Beaumont threw his lot in with young Henry early, only to watch the rebellion collapse. He spent years begging for forgiveness before getting his lands back. William de Tannquarville chose the king's side but offended Henry II by demanding too many favors afterward. He got exiled anyway. The records are full of knights who misjudged the situation and paid for it. William took an unusual approach. He joined young Henry's faction but avoided burning bridges with the king. While other rebels ransacked royal lands, Marshal focused on protecting his own men and keeping options open. He became young Henry's tournament partner and bodyguard, close enough to earn trust, but not so close he couldn't switch sides later. The rebellion dragged on for 18 months. Young Henry's forces got crushed repeatedly. His French allies abandoned him. By the end, even his mother Eleanor, who'd encouraged the revolt, was captured and imprisoned by Henry II. Most of the rebels surrendered or fled. William did neither. He stuck with young Henry until the bitter end, escorting him to his father's court for the humiliating peace negotiations. Here's where things get interesting. Instead of punishing William, Henry II recognized his loyalty to young Henry as a virtue. The king needed men who'd stand by his troublesome sons without encouraging their worst impulses. William had proven he could do that. While other rebels lost lands or titles, Marshal got invited to join the royal household. This wasn't luck. William had played the long game. He'd never attacked Henry II's lands personally. He'd avoided the worst excesses of young Henry's faction. Most importantly, he demonstrated that his loyalty could survive even a losing battle. To a king surrounded by fair-weather friends, that mattered more than blind obedience. The aftermath revealed William's real talent. He became young Henry's tutor in arms, responsible for keeping the restless prince out of trouble. When young Henry rebelled again in 1183, William stayed loyal again. But this time he also secretly warned Henry II about his son's plans. This balancing act kept him in favor with both sides. Young Henry's sudden death in 1183 from dysentery changed everything. Most of his followers scattered, their prospects ruined. William did the opposite. He carried his Lord's cross to Jerusalem as promised, fulfilling the dead prince's crusading vow. When he returned 2 years later, Henry II welcomed him back like a prodigal son. That's how you turn failure into career advancement. The whole episode shows William's political instincts at work. He understood that medieval loyalty wasn't absolute. You could serve a rebellious prince without becoming a traitor, so long as you remembered who ultimately held power. Other knights treated politics like a tournament: pick a side and fight. William treated it like chess, thinking several moves ahead. His reward came quickly. Henry II made him a royal justiciar, putting him in charge of legal matters and military campaigns. He got lands in England and Normandy. Most importantly, he gained the king's trust during a period when Henry was purging former rebels from court. William went from unemployed knight to royal favorite in under 5 years. The key was his refusal to act desperate. While other knights groveled for forgiveness, William simply did his job well. He let his actions speak for him. When young Henry's widow needed an escort back to France, William volunteered, knowing it would put him back in Henry II's line of sight. Every move calculated, every risk measured. This period also reveals how medieval power really worked. Loyalty mattered, but flexibility mattered more. William survived because he could shift allegiances without appearing disloyal. He backed young Henry just enough to prove his worth, but not so much that Henry II couldn't forgive him. It was a tightrope walk few managed successfully. By the time Richard the Lionheart rebelled against Henry II in 1188, William had perfected his approach. He stayed officially neutral while quietly supporting the king. When Richard won anyway, William smoothly transitioned to the new regime. The man who'd backed two failed rebellions somehow emerged stronger each time. That's the real lesson here. In medieval politics, it wasn't about choosing the winning side. It was about making sure no matter who won, you remained useful. William's early gamble on young Henry should have ruined him. Instead, it became the foundation for everything that followed, because he understood that sometimes losing with dignity is better than winning badly. In 1189, William Marshal faced a strange problem. He'd become too good at his job. Richard the Lionheart, freshly crowned King of England, looked at his father's most capable knight and saw a threat. Never mind that William had served the crown faithfully for decades. Richard had spent years fighting his own family, and he wasn't about to trust anyone who'd been close to his father. So he did what paranoid kings do. He exiled Marshal without explanation. This wasn't personal, just practical. Richard was leaving for the Third Crusade and couldn't risk leaving behind a popular military leader who might challenge his authority. Other knights faced worse fates. William de Mandeville got stripped of his titles for allegedly conspiring with Richard's brother John. Hugh de Puiset found himself locked in Winchester Castle for being too influential with the northern barons. Exile was almost a compliment. It meant Richard considered you dangerous enough to remove, but not enough to execute. William didn't protest. He'd seen this game before. Instead of begging for forgiveness, he went to Normandy and started building a new life. The records show he spent time at the court of Count Philip of Flanders, a powerful French noble who happened to be Richard's rival. This wasn't accidental. William knew exiled knights could still be useful as political pawns. Philip welcomed him warmly, recognizing the value of having England's best warrior on his payroll. The exile years reveal William's talent for turning setbacks into opportunities. While technically banned from England, he wasn't idle. He fought in tournaments across France, maintaining his reputation and income. He negotiated private contracts with various lords who needed experienced commanders. Most importantly, he built connections across European courts that most English knights never accessed. By the time Richard needed him again, William had become an international figure rather than just another English baron. Richard's crusade didn't go as planned. Captured by the Duke of Austria on his way home, the king needed every ally he could get to raise his enormous ransom. Suddenly, that exiled knight in Flanders looked useful again. William got recalled in 1194, not out of kindness but necessity. Richard needed men who could navigate both English and continental politics to gather his ransom money. The reconciliation was strictly business. Richard didn't apologize for the exile, and William didn't ask him to. They worked together professionally. The king got his ransom money, and William got his lands back. But the dynamic had changed. William now had leverage. His time abroad meant he wasn't solely dependent on Richard's favor anymore. If the king exiled him again, he had other options. This period shows how medieval power really worked. Loyalty was negotiable, and exile was often temporary. William used his banishment to diversify his connections rather than sulk. Other exiled knights like William Longchamp wasted their time plotting against Richard from abroad. Marshal did the opposite. He made himself valuable to multiple rulers simultaneously. The practical benefits emerged quickly. When Richard died in 1199, William was perfectly positioned to navigate the succession crisis between John and Arthur of Brittany. His continental connections gave him insights most English barons lacked. He'd spent years observing French politics firsthand while technically still serving the English crown. This insider knowledge helped him advise King John more effectively than knights who'd never left England. Exile also changed William's fighting style. Exposure to French and Flemish military tactics made him more versatile. He incorporated new siege techniques and cavalry formations he'd seen abroad. Later battles showed this influence. His forces moved differently than typical English armies, often catching opponents off guard. The financial impact was just as significant. While in Flanders, William secured lucrative trade agreements for his English estates. He arranged for Flemish merchants to buy his wool directly, cutting out middlemen. By the time he returned, his lands were producing more income than before his exile. Other barons stuck to traditional farming methods. William had international business connections. Perhaps the most surprising outcome was personal. During his exile, William befriended knights from across Europe who later became valuable allies. When he needed mercenaries for John's wars in Normandy, he could recruit experienced Flemish soldiers at short notice. When negotiating with French nobles, he had personal relationships to leverage. These connections lasted decades, outliving multiple kings. Richard never fully trusted William again, but he didn't need to. Their relationship became purely transactional. The king provided opportunities, and the knight delivered results. This was actually better for William. Emotional attachments got knights killed. Clear contracts kept them alive. The exile taught him that royal favor was fickle, but skills were permanent. The recall itself was telling. Richard didn't send a heartfelt letter begging William to return. He issued a terse order through official channels, treating it like recalling any other resource. William responded with equal professionalism, neither gloating nor resentful. Both men understood this was politics, not personal. By the time William returned to England, he transformed from a loyal knight into a political operator with international reach. The exile that should have ended his career actually expanded it. Where other men saw banishment as failure, William saw it as networking opportunity. When he finally got his old lands back, they came with something more valuable: options. This pattern would repeat throughout his life. Each setback became a chance to diversify his alliances. When King John later turned against him, William again had alternatives ready. The lesson was clear. In medieval politics, survival depended on never having all your eggs in one royal basket. William mastered this better than anyone, and it started with those years in Flanders where he turned exile into advantage. The final irony? Richard probably regretted exiling him. During the king's disastrous later campaigns in France, he desperately needed commanders of William's caliber. By then, Marshal had learned to ration his loyalty carefully. He helped when it suited him, but never again committed blindly to any single ruler. That cautious approach would serve him well through the turbulent reign of King John and beyond. Exile hadn't broken William, it had made him untouchable. In 1189, William Marshal nearly lost his chance at becoming an earl because of a horse. Not just any horse, a war horse worth more than some castles. These animals weren't just transportation. A fully trained destrier could cost up to 80 pounds, about 10 years' income for a typical knight. They were the tanks of medieval warfare, bred for strength and aggression. The best ones came from Spain and cost small fortunes. Marshal had plenty of experience with expensive horses. His tournament career taught him how crucial they were. A good war horse could mean the difference between capturing a noble opponent and being captured yourself. He owned several, including one legendary animal that allegedly carried him through 60 tournament victories. But the horse that changed his life wasn't his best, just the most politically useful. Here's how it happened. After returning from exile, Marshal served King Richard while quietly cultivating ties with his brother John. When Richard died in 1199, John needed allies fast. His rival Arthur of Brittany had strong claims to the throne and French backing. John promised Marshal the earldom of Pembroke, a huge stretch of land in Wales, if he'd support his claim. There was just one problem. John was notoriously bad at keeping promises. Marshal played it smart. Instead of immediately demanding his reward, he gave John a gift, one of his best war horses. This wasn't generosity. It was a test. Medieval kings showed favor through reciprocal gift-giving. By accepting the horse, John implicitly agreed to reward Marshal properly. The knight later admitted he'd worried John might take Pembroke without giving anything in return. The horse forced the issue. Pembroke wasn't handed over immediately. John stalled for months, hoping Marshal would forget. The horse kept the bargain alive in everyone's minds. Finally, in 1200, John formally granted the title. The records don't say if it was the same horse that sealed the deal, but the timing suggests it was. Marshal got control of strategic lands in Wales and Ireland overnight. The former landless knight was now one of England's most powerful barons. The economics behind this are fascinating. Pembroke's lands generated about £400 yearly, enough to support 100 knights. Marshal's total worth jumped from maybe £200 to over £2,000. That single war horse, worth perhaps £50 at most, had secured assets worth 10 times as much. It was the best investment he ever made. Other knights tried similar tactics with less success. William de Braose famously gave John expensive gifts, but still lost his lands later. What made Marshal's move different was timing. He gave the horse when John desperately needed support, not afterward when the king felt secure. The gesture also suited medieval concepts of reciprocity. A king who accepted such a valuable gift and gave nothing in return would look weak. Pembroke changed everything for Marshal. He suddenly had castles, ports, and armies at his command. More importantly, he had status. Earls sat at the king's council and shaped policy. Marshal went from respected knight to power broker overnight. All because he understood the unspoken rules of medieval politics better than anyone else. The lands weren't just symbolic either. Pembroke controlled key routes to Ireland and contained rich farmlands. Its ports connected England to continental Europe. Marshal spent years consolidating his hold, appointing loyal administrators and fortifying castles. Unlike many nobles who neglected their estates, he personally visited Pembroke regularly. The earldom became both his power base and insurance policy against royal disfavor. Interestingly, Marshal almost missed his chance by being too generous earlier. During Richard's reign, he'd given away several prize horses to lesser knights in need. His biographer praises this as chivalrous, but it nearly cost him politically. Had he not kept at least one exceptional animal in reserve, he might not have had suitable currency when dealing with John. The lesson was clear. In medieval politics, even kindness required calculation. The horse transaction also revealed Marshal's understanding of John's psychology. The king loved hunting and fine horses almost as much as power. By appealing to this vanity, Marshal ensured his request stuck in John's mind. Other barons offered gold or land deals. Marshal offered something personal that the king would use and remember daily. After securing Pembroke, Marshal continued collecting war horses strategically. His stables became famous across Europe, filled with animals gifted from allies and captured in tournaments. Each represented political capital he could deploy when needed. The earldom gave him resources to breed his own exceptional stock too, creating a self-sustaining cycle of influence. Looking back, it's remarkable how much turned on one animal. In another knight's hands, that horse might have been ridden into battle or sold for cash. Marshal saw its true value as political leverage. The move sums up his entire career, turning practical assets into long-term advantage while appearing generous. Most medieval nobles inherited their status. Marshal literally bought his way into the aristocracy using horse trading skills sharpened in tournaments. Pembroke became the foundation for everything that followed. His role in Magna Carta, his regency for Henry III, his family's rise to prominence. All because he knew when to give away a prized possession and when to hold one back for the right moment. In the end, that warhorse did more than carry a rider into battle. It carried a landless knight's descendants into England's highest nobility for generations. Not bad for a transaction where nobody even mentioned money. The records don't say what happened to the animal afterward, but knowing Marshal, he probably got it back eventually along with everything else. King John didn't just distrust William Marshal, he actively worked to destroy him. Most barons in John's England knew better than to trust their king, but Marshal faced a special kind of attention. The same man who'd gifted him Pembroke just years earlier now systematically stripped him of lands and titles. In 1205, John confiscated Marshal's lands in Ireland. In 1207, he seized the castle at Cardigan. Each time, the king cited flimsy excuses about loyalty tests or temporary administrative needs. Everyone knew the truth. John attacked anyone he suspected might challenge him. Other nobles fared much worse. William de Braose, once one of John's favorites, lost everything after a financial dispute. His family fled to Ireland, where John allegedly starved de Braose's wife and son to death in captivity. Robert Fitzwalter saw his castle demolished and spent years in exile. Even Archbishop Langton got banished for 5 years just for defending church rights. Against this backdrop, Marshal's losses seemed mild, but they kept coming with mechanical regularity. The pattern was clear. Provoke the king, lose your head. Stay too quiet, lose your lands. Marshal responded with his usual strategic patience. He didn't join the rebellious barons when they first rose up in 1212. Instead, he paid the exorbitant fees John demanded to regain each confiscated property. He attended court when summoned and stayed quiet when not. This infuriated the king. John preferred enemies he could crush outright or allies he could dominate completely. Marshal occupied a frustrating middle ground, always just cooperative enough to avoid treason charges but never submissive enough to satisfy. The situation came to a head in 1213. John, fresh from his excommunication by the Pope, needed experienced commanders for a campaign in France. He summoned Marshal back to service, but with a revealing condition: Marshal had to surrender 2 grandsons as hostages. This was unusually harsh even for John, since noble hostages were typically adults. Taking children signaled deep distrust. Marshal complied without protest, knowing refusal would give John an excuse for harsher measures. What John didn't realize was that Marshal had been preparing for this moment for years. Unlike other barons who kept all their wealth in vulnerable castles, Marshal had quietly diversified. Some assets remained in Ireland under Allies' protection. Others were invested in Templar holdings that even kings hesitated to touch. His international contacts meant he could always find employment abroad if needed. Most importantly, he built a reputation so spotless that even John hesitated to execute him outright. Their final confrontation came during the Magna Carta crisis. When rebel barons forced John to sign the Great Charter in 1215, Marshal was conspicuously neutral. He neither joined the rebellion nor vigorously defended John. This careful positioning paid off spectacularly when John repudiated the charter months later. The rebels became outlaws overnight, while loyalists like Hubert de Burgh got stuck defending an increasingly unstable king. Marshal? He emerged as the only major figure everyone still trusted. John's death in 1216 revealed Marshal's genius. The king's 9-year-old heir Henry III needed a regent who could unite the fractured kingdom. The rebel barons wouldn't accept a staunch royalist. The royalists wouldn't accept a former rebel. Marshal, the man who'd somehow navigated John's reign with lands and honor intact, became the obvious compromise. That calculated neutrality John had hated now made Marshal indispensable. The survival strategy boiled down to 3 principles. First, Marshal never let John isolate him politically. Even while serving the king, he maintained ties to rebel factions through marriages and old tournament friendships. Second, he always provided something irreplaceable, whether military expertise during the French campaigns or diplomatic connections to the Templars. Third, and most crucially, he understood John's psychology. The king distrusted overt loyalty because he assumed everyone lied. Marshal's visible pragmatism actually made him more credible. Financial maneuvering played a key role too. When John demanded exorbitant fines for the return of confiscated lands, Marshal paid promptly, then quietly recouped the cost through Ireland's thriving wool trade. Other barons borrowed from Jewish moneylenders and fell into debt spirals when John taxed those loans. Marshal worked primarily through Templar financiers whose assets John couldn't touch. Every pound stayed under his control, not the king's. The ultimate proof of Marshal's strategy came after John's death. As regent, he recovered all his lost lands within months. The grandsons taken hostage were returned unharmed. Even rebel barons who'd fought against John accepted his leadership during the regency. That never would have happened had he been either a die-hard royalist or committed rebel. His ability to be disliked but respected by a paranoid king turned out to be his greatest asset. John would have hated the final irony. The knight who survived his distrust wound up saving his dynasty. Without Marshal's regency, the rebel barons might have placed Louis of France on England's throne. Instead, Marshal stabilized the country long enough for Henry III to grow into his role. Not bad for a man who spent 17 years as John's least favorite subject. The lesson was clear in medieval politics. Sometimes surviving a bad king meant refusing to be either his enemy or his friend. Marshal rode out John's tantrums like storms, battening down hatches when necessary, knowing the winds would eventually change. While others took dramatic stands and paid dearly for them, he focused on simple goals. Keep your options open, your reputation clean, and your assets scattered. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. By the time John died, Marshal wasn't just alive. He was positioned to become the most powerful man in England. The year was 1215, and England's barons had reached their breaking point. King John's endless taxes, arbitrary seizures of land, and habit of taking noble hostages had pushed them to rebellion. They forced him to sign Magna Carta, a document meant to curb royal power. Most saw it as a victory. William Marshal saw it as a ticking time bomb. He knew John would never honor those promises, and when the king inevitably broke them, everyone who'd backed the charter would become a traitor overnight. While other barons celebrated, Marshal stayed quiet. He didn't refuse to sign, but he didn't lead the charge either. This wasn't indecision, it was calculation. He'd watched John for years. The king had exiled him, confiscated his lands, even taken his grandsons hostage. Yet Marshal understood something crucial. Rebellions rarely succeeded without foreign backing. The barons had invited Louis of France to replace John, which meant even if they won, England would just swap one tyrant for another. The fallout was predictable. John renounced Magna Carta within months, plunging England into civil war. Rebel barons like Robert Fitzwalter seized royal castles, only to lose them again when John's mercenaries counterattacked. By 1216, many rebels were landless fugitives. Even the Archbishop of Canterbury fled to France. Marshal? He kept Pembroke Castle fully garrisoned but never openly defied the king. When John demanded troops for his campaigns, Marshal sent just enough to avoid treason charges, but never so many that he couldn't protect his own lands if things went sideways. His neutrality wasn't cowardice. It was insurance. Marshal maintained back-channel contacts with both sides. He hosted rebel leaders at his estates, listening to their grievances while carefully avoiding commitments. Simultaneously, he continued advising John on military strategy, positioning himself as the king's least replaceable counselor. This balancing act infuriated extremists on both sides, but it kept his options open when others had none left. John's sudden death in October 1216 changed everything. His 9-year-old son Henry III inherited a kingdom at war, with half the barons supporting French invasion. The royalists needed a leader who could unite the country, someone rebels might tolerate. Marshal, now in his 70s, was the only candidate everyone could grudgingly accept. The man who'd refused to join the rebellion now became regent for the child king. His first move was genius. He reissued Magna Carta under Henry's name, stripping out the clauses most offensive to royal authority while keeping the popular reforms. Rebels could now lay down arms without admitting defeat, since technically they'd gotten what they wanted. The French lost their pretext for invasion. Over the next 2 years, Marshal methodically peeled barons away from Louis's camp by restoring their confiscated lands, but only if they pledged loyalty to Henry. The financial maneuvering behind this was impressive. Marshal funded the royal war effort by borrowing from the Knights Templar instead of taxing barons into rebellion like John had. He knew Templar loans came without political strings, since the order stayed neutral in secular conflicts. Meanwhile, he quietly let rebel-held castles surrender with honor rather than storming them, knowing humiliation would only breed future resistance. By 1217, the tide had turned. Marshal led Henry's forces to victory at Lincoln, capturing dozens of rebel leaders, but immediately pardoning them. When Louis's reinforcements arrived later that year, Marshal's fleet destroyed them at Sandwich. Again, he offered generous terms. French troops could leave England unharmed if they abandoned the invasion. Louis slunk back to Paris, and the barons grudgingly accepted Henry's rule. Marshal's loyalty calculus had paid off spectacularly. The rebels who'd gambled on overthrowing John were now indebted to the very regime they'd fought against. Men like Fitzwalter got their lands back, but lost any real political influence. Marshal, meanwhile, became the de facto ruler of England during Henry's minority. He controlled the royal seal, appointed sheriffs, and even negotiated with foreign powers, all without ever technically rebelling. The lesson was clear in medieval politics. Revolutions rarely benefit their starters. Marshal had watched Henry II crush rebellions, seen Richard Lionheart betray his own father, and endured John's paranoia. He understood that in the long game, survival mattered more than short-term victories. While hot-headed barons lost everything chasing immediate revenge, he secured his family's future by playing the uncommitted middle ground until the chaos passed. His final masterstroke came in 1219. Dying and on his deathbed, Marshal arranged for Magna Carta to be issued a third time, cementing it as permanent law. The document that began as a rebel bargaining chip now bore the seal of the king those rebels had fought against. Marshal, the man who'd technically been on John's side, ensured the rebellion's core demand outlived them all. The rebels never got what they truly wanted, a king bound by law. But Marshal did. By waiting out the storm, he became the one who decided what parts of their revolution stuck. The barons who'd risked everything got pardons. Marshal got a legacy. When historians say he was instrumental in shaping the principles by which much of the world is now governed, this is what they mean. Not through rebellion or blind loyalty, but by knowing when to stand still while everyone else rushed headlong into chaos. In the end, his neutrality wasn't just survival, it was domination. The rebels fought for change. Marshal made sure he controlled how that change happened. The greatest knight in England didn't win by picking sides. He won by making sure every side eventually needed him. Most 70-year-old knights in 1216 were either retired or dead. William Marshal became regent of England. The kingdom was a mess. bankrupt from King John's wars, split by civil war, with half the nobles still supporting a French prince's invasion. The new king, Henry III, was a 9-year-old boy. Someone had to run things, and somehow that someone wound up being the most battle-scarred knight in the realm. Marshal faced problems that would have broken younger men. The treasury was empty. Rebel barons controlled key castles. French troops held London. The papal legate wanted influence over royal decisions. Normally, this would be a recipe for disaster. Medieval regencies usually ended with someone getting poisoned or overthrown. But Marshal had two advantages. Nobody questioned his loyalty, and everyone was too exhausted to keep fighting. His first move was clever. He reissued Magna Carta under Henry's name, but with key changes. The most radical clauses limiting royal power got trimmed, while popular ones about fair trials and inheritance rights stayed. Rebels could now surrender without losing face. Technically, they'd won the reforms they wanted. The French lost their excuse for invading, since Henry wasn't the tyrant John had been. It was politics at its most practical. Give people just enough to make further fighting pointless. Money was the real crisis. John had drained the treasury buying mercenaries. Marshal needed funds to pay garrisons and officials, but couldn't tax the war-ravaged counties. His solution? Borrow from the Knights Templar. Unlike Jewish moneylenders who reported to the king, the Templars answered only to the Pope. Their loans came with no political strings, just interest. Marshal also restarted the legal system, letting courts settle land disputes again. Every case brought in fees, and every settled dispute meant one less angry noble. The military situation was worse. Rebel castles dotted the countryside. French troops under Prince Louis controlled the southeast. Marshal avoided costly sieges by offering generous terms. Surrender your castle, swear loyalty to Henry, and keep your lands. Most took the deal. For the holdouts, he led troops himself at the Battle of Lincoln in 1217, at an age when most nobles were confined to bed. Wearing full armor, he reportedly fought like a man half his age. The victory crippled the rebel forces, but Marshal didn't gloat. Captured barons were ransomed cheaply or pardoned outright. Diplomacy mattered as much as battles. Marshal played the papal legate against the French, convincing each that supporting Henry served their interests. He let the legate think he controlled church appointments, while quietly ensuring royal allies got key positions. When French reinforcements arrived later that year, Marshal's navy destroyed them at Sandwich. Again, he offered easy terms. Louis's troops could leave England unharmed if they gave up the invasion. The alternative was starvation in besieged ports. The French chose to leave. Daily governance fell to Marshal's small council, trusted men from his old tournament days and royal service. They standardized weights and measures to restart trade. They confirmed land titles to reduce disputes. Most importantly, they kept the government functioning when most medieval regimes would have collapsed. Marshal's decades of military logistics made him oddly suited for bureaucracy. He understood supply chains and record-keeping mattered as much as swords. The Regency's Real test came in 1218. With the French gone and rebels pacified, some barons expected Marshal to grab more power. Instead, he began preparing Henry to rule. He brought the boy king on progresses through the country, teaching him how to judge cases and greet subjects. He arranged Latin lessons and military training. Most regents clung to power until forced out. Marshal seemed eager to retire, if only his health had held. By 1219, the kingdom was stable, but Marshal was fading. His final act was overseeing a third issuance of Magna Carta, making the reforms permanent English law. The charter that began as a rebel bargaining chip now had the royal seal. On his deathbed, Marshal reportedly told Henry to keep peace with all men if you can. Not exactly revolutionary advice, but coming from a man who'd survived 5 kings, it carried weight. The Regency succeeded where it mattered most. Henry kept his crown. The French went home. The barons stopped fighting. England even repaid most Templar loans. Marshal showed that medieval governance worked best when someone put stability above ambition. His final political move was typically practical. He divided his vast lands among 5 sons, ensuring no single heir became powerful enough to threaten the crown. The old knight spent his life serving kings, and in the end, he gave the next one fewer problems to solve. Seen one way, Marshal's regency was miraculous, an illiterate warrior holding a fractured kingdom together through sheer force of character. Seen another way, it was the logical result of his whole career. Every tournament ruse, every political dodge, every calculated loyalty had trained him for this. Governing England just required the same skills as surviving John's court, knowing when to fight, when to deal, and when to let the other side think they'd won. The greatest night became, for 2 brief years, England's uncrowned ruler simply because no one else could be trusted to hand power back when the job was done. His tomb effigy in Temple Church still shows him smiling slightly, as if amused by the whole improbable story. A landless knight's son who wound up saving a kingdom, then died in bed at 72. Even by medieval standards, that was a good run. The Regency proved one thing: surviving kings was hard work. Raising one to be better than his predecessors? That was Marshal's last and least likely victory. In May 1219, William Marshal lay dying at his Caversham estate, and the vultures were already circling. At 72, he'd outlived nearly everyone who'd ever crossed him, but now his enemies saw their chance. The greatest night in England was about to become a memory, and everyone knew what usually happened next in these situations. The crown would seize his lands, rivals would pick apart his estates, and his family would be lucky to keep their titles, let alone their heads. Marshal had seen this story play out too many times. When a powerful noble died, the feeding frenzy began. Just look at the de Braose family. After they fell out with King John, their lands were confiscated and the widow and heir were allegedly starved to death in Windsor Castle. Marshal's own father-in-law had lost half his properties because he didn't arrange his succession properly. This wasn't just about wills and inheritances, it was about survival. So Marshal got to work. First, he summoned Henry III Regency Council to his bedside. Not to beg, to negotiate. His opening move? Voluntarily surrendering his 2 royal castles at Cardigan and Pembroke back to the crown. This looked like loyalty, but it was actually insurance. By giving up these strategic strongholds first, he removed any excuse for the crown to seize his family's other lands later. Then he made his 5 sons swear allegiance to the young king publicly, binding Henry's government to protect them in return. The real masterstroke was how he divided his estate. Instead of leaving everything to his eldest son, the standard practice that often caused bitter family disputes, Marshal split his lands equally among all 5 sons. This wasn't generosity, it was math. No single heir would be powerful enough to threaten the crown, decreasing the chance Henry's advisors would see them as a problem needing resolution. The younger sons got enough to stay loyal to their elder brother, creating a family block too big to attack easily. Marshal knew the church was watching too, so he played that angle. He asked to be buried as a Templar knight, wrapping himself in the order's protection even in death. The Temple Church in London wasn't just a holy site, it was political cover. Any attack on his heirs would now technically disrespect the Templars, which meant risking trouble with the Pope. He also left the order enough money to pray for his soul regularly, ensuring monks would keep his memory and his family's claims alive through sermons. The dying knight even managed his reputation posthumously. He commissioned a biography, an extremely rare move for a non-royal, that carefully documented his loyalty to every king he'd served. This wasn't vanity, it was a shield for his family. Future monarchs would find it harder to besmirch the name of England's greatest knight if his heroism was literally written down and circulating at court. The book repeatedly stressed how he'd never broken his oath, creating a standard his descendants could invoke if accused of disloyalty. Marshal's final hours were a masterclass in medieval realpolitik. He received the king's ministers while lying on a bed covered with a simple cloak, looking every inch the modest servant. But his words were pure strategy. He reminded them how he'd saved Henry's crown during the rebellion, how he'd repaid England's debts to the Templars, how he'd never taken more land than his service deserved. Then, in his last conscious act as patriarch, he made the regent's promise, in front of witnesses, to protect his widow Isabel. Isabel was the linchpin. At 45, she was young enough to remarry someone powerful, which could safeguard the Marshal estates. She also controlled her own inherited lands in Ireland, separate from William's holdings. By ensuring her security, Marshal created a backup plan. If his sons lost everything, Isabel's properties could support them. Contemporary records show she later used these Irish lands to bail out at least one son facing financial trouble. The funeral itself was a political statement. Hundreds of Templars attended, their presence subtly warning against any posthumous land grabs. The ceremony stressed Marshal's piety, another protective layer for his heirs, while displaying just enough wealth to remind everyone the family still mattered. His effigy showed him not in royal robes or battle gear, but as a simple knight, the image he'd always found most useful. It worked better than he could have hoped. while other noble clans collapsed after their patriarchs died. Just look at the Declares, who lost half their lands in the 1230 succession squabbles. The Marshals held on. All 5 sons kept their inheritances. Isabel lived until 1220, long enough to see them established. The crown never pushed the family too hard, perhaps remembering how that deathbed negotiation had boxed them in. Even Marshal's tomb survived Henry VIII's later destruction of the Templars, almost as if history itself couldn't quite erase him. The kicker? That biography he commissioned. It resurfaced centuries later in the library of a French count, reminding modern historians why they'd nearly forgotten England's greatest knight in the first place. Marshal hadn't just protected his family's future, he'd accidentally preserved his own legacy by ensuring someone wrote it all down. Most medieval strongmen are remembered as tyrants or victims. Marshal engineered a third option, the man who cheated the system one last time by dying too cleverly to punish. The tomb in Temple Church still bears his likeness, legs casually crossed as if death was just another tournament he'd learned to win. His heirs eventually died out, his castles crumbled, but that stone figure makes his final point. You attack a man's memory at your peril when he spent 70 years thinking several moves ahead. Even flat on his back with death coming, William Marshal proved the same thing he had at age 5 by the hanging tree. Survival isn't about strength. It's about knowing how the ropes are tied. History has a funny way of remembering the wrong people. For 700 years after his death, England's greatest knight virtually disappeared from the record books. William Marshal's tomb in London's Temple Church gathered dust while flashier kings and conquerors stole the spotlight. Then in 1861, a French graduate student named Paul Meyer walked into a Sotheby's auction and stumbled across a manuscript that would change everything. The poem, written in medieval French verse, was sitting in a pile of random historical documents. Meyer didn't have the £380 to buy it. That's about $50,000 today, but he never forgot what he'd seen. 20 years later, now a respected scholar, he tracked it down in a private collection. What he found was a 19,000-line biography of William Marshal, written shortly after the knight's death by someone who'd known him personally. It was like finding a lost season of Game of Thrones buried in someone's attic. Here's why this matters. Medieval fame was notoriously fickle. Unless you were a king or saint, chances were your story wouldn't survive more than a generation or two. Take Robert Guiscard, the Norman adventurer who conquered southern Italy in the 11th century. Dude was basically the medieval equivalent of Alexander the Great, yet today most people couldn't pick him out of a lineup. Even Marshal's contemporaries like William Longsword, Henry III's uncle, faded into obscurity despite their exploits. The poem's survival was pure luck. Written around 1226, it barely made it through the Reformation when Henry VIII destroyed most Templar records. Somehow this one copy slipped through, bouncing between private collectors for centuries. No other medieval knight got this treatment, not even famous ones like Richard the Lionheart's champion William de Bars. The anonymous poet didn't just document Marshal's battles. He recorded conversation snippets, tournament strategies, even what the old knight said on his deathbed. Meyer spent 10 years translating and publishing the manuscript between 1891 to 1901. Suddenly historians had a Rosetta Stone for 12th century politics. The poem revealed how Marshal brokered peace between Henry II and his rebellious sons, why John hated him so much, and how he saved England from French invasion during the Magna Carta mess. Before this, Marshal was just another name in royal accounting rolls, the guy who received X pounds for Y service. Now he had a personality. The rediscovery sparked a reassessment. Historians realized Marshal wasn't just some hired sword. He'd shaped England's legal system during Henry III's regency, pioneered knightly tournament tactics, and set precedents for noble marriages that lasted centuries. That bit about him defeating 500 knights in tournaments? Probably exaggerated. But the political maneuvering? Dead accurate. Court records proved he'd been present at every major crisis from 1170 to 1219. Modern scholars piece together how Marshal's reputation faded. After his sons died without heirs in the 1240s, their lands got redistributed. No estates meant no family chroniclers keeping his memory alive. The Templars who guarded his tomb got dissolved in 1312. Meanwhile, kings preferred promoting legends about Richard the Lionheart or King Arthur, figures they could control. A knight who rose through merit rather than birth didn't fit the feudal narrative. The poem corrected distortions. It showed Marshal refusing to assassinate Eleanor of Aquitaine when Henry II ordered it. It described his policy of pardoning rebels who surrendered. Most importantly, it proved he'd been the stabilizing force during England's most chaotic constitutional crisis. 20th century historians like Sidney Painter built careers analyzing these revelations. Suddenly, Marshal wasn't just a side character. He was the guy who made Magna Carta stick. Today, you'll find Marshal biographies in every medieval study section. His tomb in Temple Church, rebuilt after World War II bombings, gets more visitors than many royal graves. The British Museum displays his seal. Yet here's the kicker, that original manuscript? It vanished again after Meyer's death. Scholars think it's sitting in some collector's vault, waiting for another grad student to stumble across it. The story keeps evolving. In 2019, archaeologists used ground-penetrating radar at one of Marshal's old castles in Ireland. They found tournament lists matching descriptions from the poem. Last year, a financial record surfaced showing Marshal paid the equivalent of $2 million to ransom Richard the Lionheart's mercenaries. Each discovery adds nuance to the poem's account. Marshal's rehabilitation highlights how history gets curated. The kings and popes who dominate textbooks were often less influential than the operators working behind the scenes. That French poem, intended as a tribute by some forgotten bard, accidentally preserved the real story of how England survived its darkest political crisis. Not through some romantic ideal of chivalry, but through one pragmatic knight's understanding of when to swing a sword and when to cut a deal. The tomb's Latin inscription calls Marshal the best knight who ever lived. For centuries, nobody knew why. Now we do. Not because of some mythic heroism, but because he left receipts. Actual documentation of how power really worked in the Middle Ages. Turns out the greatest knight in English history wasn't forgotten after all. He was just waiting for someone to bother reading the fine print. The tournament crowds cheered for William Marshal's victories, but they never saw what happened in the mud after the fights. Medieval tournaments weren't the noble spectacles you see in movies. They were brutal cash grabs where knights routinely broke bones, got trampled, or took lances to the face. Marshal dominated the scene not through fair play, but by understanding one simple truth: nobody paid ransoms to dead men. Most knights entered tournaments for glory. Marshal went for profit. His biographer calls him miserly and materialistic, which in this case meant he cared more about capturing rich opponents than following some chivalric code. While other fighters chased dramatic single combat, Marshal's team worked together to isolate valuable targets. They'd surround a nobleman, knock him off his horse, and start negotiating ransom before the dust settled. It wasn't heroic, but it paid the bills. The injury reports from these events read like battlefield casualty lists. Chroniclers mention knights getting speared through groins, having eyes gouged out by shattered lances, or drowning in their own armor after falling into rivers. One contest in 1177 saw 12 knights killed in a single day. Marshal avoided these fates by perfecting what historians politely call sharp practices. He'd fake surrenders to lure opponents close, then tackle them. He aimed for weak points in armor rather than honorable chest blows. His signature move was dragging knights off their horses by their helmet vents, effective, but hardly the stuff of ballots. The economics encouraged this pragmatism. Capturing a wealthy baron could net 100 pounds, 5 years' salary for a normal knight. Marshal's team kept detailed lists of who could pay what, prioritizing high-value targets. They once took a count prisoner and held him until he signed over rights to a ferry crossing. Another time, they accepted 3 war horses instead of cash from a cash-strapped duke. These weren't sporting exchanges. They were ransom deals with the occasional beating involved. Equipment gave Marshal another edge. While others used tournament lances designed to break safely, he sometimes opted for sturdier battlefield spears that could impale. His armor was lighter than standard issue, trading protection for mobility. He'd wear broken-in gear that looked shabby but moved quietly, while opponents clanked around in polished parade suits. One account describes him winning a match because his opponent's visor hinge squeaked, telegraphing every move. The team tactics were even less chivalrous. Marshal's squad developed hand signals to coordinate attacks, essentially cheat codes for medieval combat. They'd pretend to flee, drawing overconfident knights into ambushes. At a tournament in Lagny-sur-Marne, they allegedly tied ropes across the field at knee height to trip charging opponents. These tricks worked so well that some lords paid Marshal not to compete in their tournaments. Early protection money from men who didn't want their knights humiliated or bankrupted. The physical toll was staggering even for the winners. Marshal suffered multiple concussions, a dislocated shoulder, and what historians suspect was chronic traumatic encephalopathy from repeated head blows. His hands showed arthritis from decades of gripping reins and weapons. X-rays of similar knights reveal compressed spines from falls and bone spurs from constant riding. This wasn't a sport, it was occupational hazard with a side pageantry. The darkest secret? Marshal probably killed more men in tournaments than in actual wars. Chroniclers mention opponents dying from injuries sustained against him, though they're careful not to blame him directly. One German knight drowned in mud after Marshal knocked him down during a rainy tournament. Another succumbed to infection from a wound Marshal gave him during a friendly match. These deaths got written off as accidents, but they all contributed to his fearsome reputation. His pragmatic approach extended to medical care. While other knights relied on prayers and leeches, Marshal employed a personal surgeon who'd stitch wounds with boiled silk and disinfect with vinegar. He kept tournament earnings in a locked chest that doubled as an operating table. The same hands that expertly broke ransom deals could set bones or trepan skulls when necessary. This medical knowledge wasn't compassion, it protected investments. A dead prisoner paid nothing. The tournaments shaped Marshal's later career. He learned to read opponents' body language during fights, a skill that helped him navigate royal courts. The resourcefulness needed to repair armor with spare parts translated into political flexibility. Even his famous loyalty to kings had roots in tournament economics. You got more repeat business if people trusted your word, even if your tactics were ruthless. Modern historians debate whether Marshal corrupted tournaments or just revealed their true nature. The events were always about money and power, not honor. He simply removed the pretense. When organizers later added rules to prevent his tactics, he adapted instantly, finding new loopholes. By the time he retired from tournaments, the sport had become safer and duller, partly because nobody wanted another William Marshal dominating through brains rather than bravado. The records are clear about one thing: Marshal never apologized for his methods. When criticized for unsporting behavior, he'd point to his ledger books full of ransom payments. His tomb effigy shows him smiling slightly, as if amused by nobles who still pretended tournaments were about glory rather than survival. The greatest knight in England didn't win by following rules. He won by realizing they were just suggestions. You'd think serving kings would pay the bills, but William Marshal kept discovering royal treasuries were mysteriously empty when payday came. Between 1170 to 1189, he learned the hard truth about medieval military service. Kings expected loyalty, but often forgot the salary part. So he did what any practical knight would do. He sold his sword to the highest bidder. The economics were simple. A fully equipped knight needed about £20 a year just to function. War horses, armor, squires, all expensive. Royal pay was erratic. Marshal started taking side gigs, first with minor lords, then foreign powers. By 1180, he was essentially a professional mercenary operating under polite fictions. The Count of Flanders paid him £200 for a year's service, 10 times what lesser knights made. This wasn't unusual for landless knights. Richard Lionheart's famous mercenary Captain Mercadier started the same way. What made Marshal different was how openly he advertised his availability. While others pretended loyalty to one master, Marshal negotiated contracts like a modern consultant. His letters mentioned stipulations about hazard pay for combat missions and bonuses for extended campaigns. The risks were real. When Marshal worked for Henry the Young King against his father Henry II, he technically committed treason. Other knights who made similar choices weren't so lucky. Adam de Port got exiled for switching sides too often. William de Bars once took French gold, but got caught, and spent 2 years regaining Richard Lionheart's trust. Marshal avoided these fates by never fully committing to any employer. His most lucrative deal came in 1182 with Geoffrey de Lusignan, a French lord fighting in Aquitaine. The contract terms survive in monastery records, £500 up front plus looting rights. That's roughly $250,000 today. For 6 months' work, Marshal earned what most knights wouldn't see in a lifetime. He used the money to buy lands in Normandy, though technically he wasn't noble enough to own them yet. Paperwork could wait when you had 60 armed men behind you. The work wasn't pretty. Mercenary contracts involved burning villages, intimidating traders, and siege warfare. Marshal's unit specialized in night attacks and bridge seizures, high-risk operations with high rewards. His accounting notes show payments for arrow procurement and wall undermining equipment, not exactly chivalric stuff. Paradoxically, this mercenary phase made Marshal more valuable to kings. Unlike domestically trained knights, he understood continental warfare. His experience facing different enemies made him adaptable. When Henry II finally recalled him from unofficial exile in 1188, it was because the aging king needed someone who could counter Philip Augustus's mercenary companies. Marshal also learned to play both sides. In 1190, while technically serving Richard Lionheart, he did freelance security work for French wine merchants moving through war zones. The same man who'd fight French troops by day was taking their coin by night to protect commerce. This wasn't treason, just business. The real genius was in contract exits. Marshal always left employers before they failed. He quit the Lusignans just before their rebellion collapsed. He exited Flanders service months before its war with France turned disastrous. Other mercenaries got trapped in losing wars. Marshal's timing was impeccable. This period strained his relationships, though. Richard Lionheart excluded him from the Third Crusade's command structure partly because of his mercenary past. Chroniclers mention tense exchanges where Richard accused Marshal of being a man of markets rather than loyalty. The insult stung precisely because it was accurate. Yet mercenary work gave Marshal something royal service never could: leverage. When John became king in 1199, he couldn't bully Marshal like other barons. Why? Because Marshal had alternative employers ready. His contacts in Flanders and Champagne meant he could always find work if John became unreasonable. The money also bought independence. Most royal knights depended on the king for armor and horses. Marshal owned everything outright. When John tried confiscating his estates in 1205, he discovered Marshal's wealth was decentralized, hidden in Templar banks, Irish pastures, and French trade deals. You can't squeeze a man who diversified his assets centuries before hedge funds existed. By 1208, Marshal had effectively retired from mercenary work, but the skills stuck. He negotiated better terms with John precisely because he'd seen how other European rulers operated. His later defense of England during the Magna Carta crisis drew directly on lessons learned selling his sword abroad. Never commit fully, always keep exits open, and understand everyone's price. The ultimate irony? When Marshal became regent in 1216, he hired mercenary companies himself to defend England. He knew exactly how to motivate them: prompt payments, looting allowances, and expiration dates on contracts. Former colleagues like Fawkes de Brut got prime positions in his regime. That mercenary phase everyone whispered about became his secret weapon. While proper lords struggled with notions of honorable warfare, Marshal understood combat was business. His tomb effigy shows him with legs crossed. Some say it's a crusader's pose, but it could just as easily be a merchant's relaxed stance after closing another deal. In the end, those years as a sword for hire didn't tarnish Marshal's reputation. They explained it. The greatest knight in England succeeded not because he believed in myths of chivalry, but because he treated war like any other transaction. Know your worth, read the contract carefully, and always collect payment up front. Not glorious, but effective. And in medieval politics, effectiveness beat glory every time. His account books survive in fragments detailing payments received from at least 13 lords across 4 countries. Not bad for a knight who supposedly lived by loyalty alone. The records show one consistent theme. Whether serving kings or merchants, Marshal always got paid. Maybe that's the real lesson. In a world of unreliable rulers, sometimes the safest loyalty is to your own balance sheet. Most knights married for land, not love, but William Marshal's marriage at 43 was something else entirely. His bride, Isabel de Clare, was 18 and the last surviving heir to massive estates in Ireland and Wales. King Richard the Lionheart arranged the match in 1189, not out of kindness, but because Marshal was one of the few men he trusted enough to control those lands. Military service wasn't paying the bills anymore. This was Marshal's big break after decades of fighting other people's wars. Age gaps like this weren't unusual. Eleanor of Aquitaine was 30 when she married 19-year-old Henry II, but they often ended badly. Take Hugh Bigot, who married a 14-year-old heiress when he was 50. She ran off with another man within a year. Or old Geoffrey de Mandeville wedding a teenage bride who promptly had his lands confiscated for conspiring against the king. These matches usually paired impatient young brides with aging warlords who just wanted sons. The result? Infidelity, property disputes, and sometimes poison in the wine. Marshal approached marriage like a military campaign. Before the wedding, he carefully inventoried Isabel's estates, castles in Pembroke, lordships in Leinster, ports, farmlands, even fishing rights. Unlike most grooms, who let their father-in-laws manage the paperwork, he personally verified every acre. This wasn't romance, it was due diligence. He knew kings could revoke land grants whenever they pleased, but marriage alliances were harder to break. The wedding itself was pure politics. Richard needed someone to secure Ireland after its Norman lords rebelled. Isabel's father had been a notorious troublemaker, so Richard picked Marshal, a proven commander without his own power base. The message was clear: control these lands, but don't get too ambitious. The ceremony happened fast because Richard was leaving for the Crusades. Marshal got a wife, a title, and instant nobility. Isabel got, well, no one asked what she wanted. Surprisingly, it worked. Unlike most medieval power couples who lived separately, Marshal and Isabel shared households. Financial records show they traveled together between England and Ireland for years. She regularly appeared with him at court, which was unusual for noble wives. When King John later tried seizing Marshal's lands, Isabel personally defended their Irish holdings, something most wives wouldn't dare. The secret? Marshal actually listened to his wife. Official documents show Isabel co-signing land grants and appearing as a witness in legal disputes. Most noble women were invisible in such matters. Letters from Irish bailiffs mention consulting both my lord and lady on management decisions. This wasn't equality by modern standards, but compared to knights who locked their wives in towers, it was revolutionary. The marriage produced 10 children, 5 sons and 5 daughters, an impressive feat considering Marshal was often away at war. More importantly, none died in childhood, which was rare. Their kids got better survival odds because Marshal could afford quality nurses and doctors. The sons all inherited portions of his lands through careful estate planning. The daughters married into powerful families, strategic alliances that extended Marshal's influence. The real test came when King John turned against Marshal in 1207. While other barons saw their wives' dowries confiscated, Isabel's Irish estate stayed safe. Marshal had legally registered them in her name, making seizure politically tricky. When John took Pembroke Castle, Isabel retreated to Ireland and administered their lands from there. Some historians think she even raised troops to defend them. Their domestic success becomes obvious when you compare Marshal to his peers. Robert Fitzwalter's marriage collapsed after he gambled away his wife's dowry. William de Brao's wife Matilda famously taunted John about murdering his nephew, a mistake that got her starved to death with her son. Marshal avoided these disasters by treating his marriage like a partnership, not just property acquisition. The financial records tell an interesting story. While most nobles pooled all resources under the husband's control, Marshal kept separate accounts for Isabel's Irish holdings. This wasn't sentiment, it was asset protection. When John demanded hostages during their feud, Marshal could truthfully say he didn't fully control certain Irish castles. They were technically Isabel's. Late in life, Marshal leaned on this arrangement again. His will divided assets equally among their 5 sons, but Isabel kept her original Irish lands as insurance. If the crown came after the Marshal heirs, she still had resources to bail them out. It worked. When their second son got captured in 1234, Isabel paid the ransom using her separate revenue streams. The tomb effigy in Temple Church shows them side by side, a rare honor for medieval women. Most knightly tombs depict wives as tiny figures kneeling at their husband's feet. Marshal shows Isabel at full scale, suggesting unusual respect. Chroniclers mention he consulted her on political matters until his death, behavior most knights consider beneath them. In the end, this arranged marriage worked better than anyone expected because Marshal broke the usual rules. He didn't ignore his teenage bride, he made her a full partner. He didn't squander her inheritance, he treated it as permanent capital. Most importantly, he recognized that political marriages only last when both parties gain something. Where other aging knights saw young wives as breeding stock, Marshal saw an alliance. Their union survived civil wars, royal persecutions, and 5 kings because Marshal understood something his peers missed: land can be seized, but a well-managed marriage was the one fortress even bad kings couldn't storm. He spent his youth mastering tournaments and battles, But this middle-aged marriage was his real career-making move. The greatest knight in England owed his titles, lands, and legacy to an 18-year-old girl, and the rare wisdom to treat that fact as an advantage, not an embarrassment. England had a boy king in 1216, but the real ruler was his 70-year-old bodyguard. When 9-year-old Henry III took the throne amid civil war and French invasion, somebody had to actually run the country. That somebody was William Marshal, the only man both royalists and rebels would tolerate as regent. It was an impossible job. Most regents either became tyrants everyone hated or got overthrown within months. Even powerful figures like William Longchamp, Richard the Lionheart's regent, had been chased out of England by angry barons. Marshal took over a broken kingdom. The treasury was empty after King John's spending. French troops held London. Rebel barons controlled key castles. Worse, medieval regencies almost always ended badly. Just look at what happened to Richard Fitzgilbert. Hugh of Lincoln's regent got poisoned by his own knights. Or William Marshal's own contemporary, Hubert de Burgh, who barely survived multiple assassination attempts during Henry's later minority. Becoming regent was often a death sentence. The old knight's first move set the tone. He reissued Magna Carta, not because he loved it, but because it removed the rebels' reason for fighting. He trimmed the most radical clauses about limiting royal power, but kept popular parts like fair inheritance laws. It was politics distilled to its essence. Give people just enough reform to make rebellion pointless. While other regents cracked down, Marshal co-opted his opponents' demands. Money was the next crisis. John had emptied the coffers. Marshal needed funds to pay garrisons and officials, but couldn't tax war-torn counties. His solution? Borrow from the Knights Templar instead of local moneylenders. Templar loans came with papal backing, but no political strings, unlike Jewish moneylenders whose debts kings often canceled. Marshal also restarted the legal system. Every settled land dispute meant fees for the treasury. He governed through a small council of trusted men, mostly fellow tournament veterans and career soldiers. No scholars, no church magnates, just pragmatic types who knew how to get things done. They standardized weights and measures to restart trade. They audited corrupt sheriffs. Most importantly, they kept the government functional when most medieval regimes would have collapsed. The military situation looked hopeless. Marshal solved it by offering rebels generous surrender terms. Give up your castle, pledge loyalty to Henry, and keep your lands. Most took the deal. For hardliners, he led troops himself at Lincoln in 1217, winning the battle but pardoning captured barons afterward. When French reinforcements arrived later that year, his navy destroyed them at Sandwich. Again, Marshal offered easy terms. French troops could leave unharmed if they quit England. Diplomacy was equally sharp. He played the papal legate against the French, convincing each that supporting Henry served their interests. The legate got to appoint bishops. The French got safe passage home. Everyone got something except the hardcore rebels, who suddenly found themselves isolated. What made Marshal different from other regents? He never acted like he enjoyed power. Most regents seized lands or titles for themselves. Marshal focused on stabilizing the kingdom for Henry's eventual rule. He made sure the young king learned statecraft, bringing him on royal progresses to judge cases and meet subjects. Unlike later regents who clung to power, Marshal seemed eager to retire. His financial reforms were brutally effective. By auditing sheriffs and resurrecting dormant taxes, he refilled the treasury without new levies. He recouped losses from John's reign by charging rebel-held castles administration fees when they surrendered. Every penny got recorded in meticulous account books that still survive. Foreign policy stayed pragmatic. Marshal abandoned John's hopeless claims in France but kept key ports like Bordeaux. He renewed trade treaties with Flanders but avoided military alliances. The message was clear. England needed peace to rebuild. Even the Pope got managed. Marshal accepted his advice on church appointments but made sure royal allies got the important bishoprics. The real test came in 1218. With the French gone and rebels pacified, some barons expected Marshal to grab more power. Instead, he focused on preparing Henry to rule. Latin tutors, military training, even etiquette lessons, the old knight wanted his charge ready. Most regents schemed to extend their rule. Marshal seemed impatient to retire. When Marshal died in 1219, England was stable, a minor miracle after John's disastrous reign. His final act? overseeing a third issuance of Magna Carta, making key reforms permanent. The document that began as a rebel ultimatum now had the royal seal, thanks to the man who'd technically been on the other side. Marshal's regency succeeded where others failed because he never confused power with ownership. He ruled like a caretaker, repairing the kingdom but never forgetting it wasn't his. Other regents built personal factions. Marshal built systems that would outlast him. His tomb effigy shows him smiling slightly, as if amused by how history's greatest knight became, briefly, its most reluctant kingmaker. The boy Henry learned well. His 56-year reign would become one of England's longest, though not without turbulence. But that's another story. For 2 years, a 70-year-old warrior proved something remarkable. Real power isn't about holding the throne. It's about knowing when to let go. The stories paint William Marshal as the perfect knight, loyal, brave, honorable. The truth is messier. Marshal did follow a code, just not the flowery version in romance poems. His was a practical guide to surviving medieval politics with your head and lands intact. Most knights idealized King Arthur's Round Table. Marshal took notes from real-life operators like Henry II, men who knew when to break oaths for power. He showed steadfast loyalty when it paid, like during young Henry's rebellion. But he also abandoned sinking ships, like quietly shifting allegiance from Richard to John when the winds changed. The histoire calls him miserly and materialistic, which in knight terms meant he actually kept track of who owed him money. Take tournaments. The chivalric code said fight honorably. Marshal's rulebook said capture wealthy opponents by any means necessary. His team tripped charging knights with hidden ropes, fake surrenders to lure enemies close, and kept list ranking prisoners by ransom value. One account has him dragging a count off his horse by the helmet vent because it worked, not because it looked good. We're showed the gap between ideal and real even clearer. When Henry II ordered Marshal to assassinate Eleanor of Aquitaine during her rebellion, the chivalrous thing would have been refusing. Marshal stalled instead, not quite disobedience, but not murder either. He tempered his martial ferocity when raw violence wouldn't serve him. Compare that to hot-headed knights like William Longespee who charged into battles they couldn't win for honor's sake, and usually lost everything. Even Marshal's famous loyalty had pragmatic roots. Staying faithful to young Henry after the failed rebellions wasn't just noble, it earned Henry II's respect for weathering storms. His later service to King John wasn't devotion, but calculation that supporting a bad king was safer than joining unreliable rebels. As the historical novel Society notes, he was a political animal first, romantic knight second. The financial side reveals most. Traditional chivalry scorned money grubbing. Marshal kept ledgers noting every ransom, gift, and debt. He married an heiress but secured her lands under separate titles so the crown couldn't confiscate them later. When John fined him 2,000 marks, Marshal paid promptly, then recouped it through Irish trade deals. This wasn't greed so much as understanding that noble standing depended on liquid assets, not just battlefield glory. His treatment of lesser knights showed similar practicality. Medieval lore praised generous lords who gave lands to followers. Marshal doled out just enough rewards to keep men loyal, but never so much that they might challenge him later. He advised Henry III to do the same with rebellious barons, pardon them but keep their castles under royal control. Deathbed decisions exposed his priorities clearest. Rather than splurging on a lavish tomb or monastery donations like most dying nobles, Marshal divided estates strategically among 5 sons to prevent crown seizure. He negotiated terms with Henry III's regents while physically weak but mentally sharp. Even final acts like joining the Templars served dual purposes: spiritual comfort plus practical protection for his heirs via church connections. Modern historians debate whether Marshal corrupted chivalry or just revealed its hidden truths. The real answer lies in his coat of arms. Simple stripes with no legendary beasts or holy symbols. Understated but effective, like his methods. Tournament wins bought land. Loyalty earned political capital. Mercy to rebels prevented future revolts. Every move calculated, nothing wasted. The histoire tries painting him as the perfect knight, but the details betray something more interesting. A man who treated chivalry like tournament rules, guidelines, not commandments. When ideals clashed with survival, survival won. Younger knights might recite poems about Lancelot. Veterans who'd fought beside Marshal knew better. The greatest knight in England succeeded not by embodying chivalry, but by mastering its loopholes. His tomb tells the real story. No grand epitaph about sacred oaths, just a worn effigy with crossed legs, smiling faintly, as if knowing future generations would struggle to reconcile his legend with his receipts. Perhaps that was the point all along. True power comes not from following codes, but knowing when to rewrite them. The final irony? Marshal's watered-down image as the perfect knight outlasted his more interesting, complicated reality. Students still read about courtly love and sacred vows while missing how he actually operated. But then, he'd likely approve. After spending a lifetime hiding pragmatism behind chivalry's mask, why break character in death? The myth served its purpose just like everything else. It kept his family safe and his legacy intact. No honorary code could have managed that. Most knights in their 60s were dead or praying in monasteries. William Marshal was leading armies. At an age when his contemporaries were retiring from warfare, if they lived that long, Marshal took charge of England's defenses during the Civil War of 1217. He was 70 years old, a grandfather several times over, and still strapping on armor for combat. Life expectancy in the Middle Ages made this extraordinary. The average knight died by 40 if battle didn't claim him first. Those who survived longer typically withdrew from active service by 50. Chroniclers mention men like Robert de Beaumont struggling to mount horses at 60. Marshal not only rode into battle at 70, he planned strategies and led from the front. His final campaign broke every convention. Most aging nobles contented themselves with advising younger knights. Marshal personally organized the royal forces against French invaders and rebel barons. While other elderly lords like William Longsword retired to their estates, Marshal was inspecting castle defenses and negotiating with mercenary captains. The physical toll was obvious. Contemporary accounts mention Marshal needing help to don his armor before Lincoln in 1217, not because he'd forgotten how, but because age had stiffened his joints. His hands showed arthritis from decades of gripping swords. Yet once armored, he reportedly fought with the same calculated efficiency that had won him tournaments 50 years earlier. What made Marshal different wasn't just his physical resilience. He used age as an advantage. Younger knights underestimated him, assuming he'd be slow or cautious. Rebel leaders thought Henry III government would collapse under an old man's leadership. They were wrong. Marshal's decades of experience let him anticipate moves that baffled younger opponents. His tactics at Lincoln demonstrated this. While junior commanders wanted frontal assaults, Marshal orchestrated flanking maneuvers using terrain he'd probably fought across decades before. He positioned archers where they could exploit gaps in rebel formations, a lesson learned from countless previous battles. When the fighting started, he reportedly identified weak points in enemy lines that others missed. The aftermath showed his political wisdom too. Where younger leaders might have executed prisoners for revenge, Marshal pardoned them. He understood that at 70, he wouldn't be around to face consequences of harsh treatment. Better to establish stability Henry III could inherit. Other knights took lands from defeated foes. Marshal restored them to earn loyalty. Modern historians debate how much of this was calculation versus necessity. The royal cause needed every experienced commander it could get. But Marshal's choices went beyond obligation. His actions suggest a man proving age didn't disqualify him from power. When others expected him to fade away, he became regent of England instead. The physical demands were staggering. Campaigning meant weeks sleeping in tents, riding through bad weather, and enduring siege conditions. Most men half Marshal's age struggled with these hardships. His household accounts show payments for special foods and medicines during campaigns, evidence he needed help maintaining his strength, but also that he knew how to get it. Marshal's late career defied medieval stereotypes about aging. While church moralists wrote about old men preparing for death, he was negotiating treaties and planning military campaigns. His contemporary, Archbishop Hubert Walter, retired from public life years before dying at about 60. Marshal remained active until months before his death at 72. There were practical reasons for this. Marshal had spent his life accumulating lands and titles. Stepping down meant risking their loss. Younger rivals would pounce on any sign of weakness. By remaining in charge, he protected his family's future. His final years weren't about glory. They were about ensuring hard-won gains wouldn't disappear. The psychological impact mattered too. In an era when power came from personal reputation, Marshal couldn't afford to seem feeble. Leading troops in his 70s sent a clear message. He remained formidable. When rebel barons heard a 70-year-old was coming against them, They expected an easy target. Instead, they got a commander who'd been waging war before they were born. Medical knowledge probably helped. Marshal employed physicians versed in Arab medicine, including treatments for joint pain and wound care. While most elderly knights relied on prayers and leeches, he had access to more advanced care. This extended his active years beyond typical limits. His final victory at Sandwich in 1217 proved age's advantages. While younger captains chased glory, Marshal focused on practical goals, destroying French ships without risking unnecessary losses. The battle secured England's coasts and forced peace negotiations. It was classic Marshal, effective rather than flashy, solving problems with minimal drama. The aftermath showed his priorities. Rather than parading his success, Marshal used the victory to stabilize Henry III government. He pardoned former rebels while quietly strengthening royal authority. These weren't a young man's impatient actions, but the considered moves of someone who'd seen how short-term wins could create long-term problems. In his last year as regent, Marshal worked to train Henry III government rather than prolong his own control. He established administrative systems that would outlast him and negotiated settlements with former enemies. While younger men might have clung to power, he prepared to hand it over, but on his terms. The contrast with other aging warriors was stark. Richard the Lionheart died, chasing a minor siege at 41. King John succumbed to illness at 49 after years of stress. Marshal outlasted them all by pacing himself, choosing battles carefully, and understanding that surviving meant more than winning any single fight. His tomb effigy in Temple Church shows a man at peace, legs crossed in apparent relaxation. The smile might reflect private amusement. While others burned out young, he kept going until his body finally gave out. In the end, age hadn't weakened Marshal. It had become his ultimate weapon, proving that in medieval politics, outlasting opponents could be as effective as outfighting them. The lesson wasn't lost on Henry III. The King Marshal served would rule for 56 years, longer than any previous English monarch. He'd learned from his old regent that endurance mattered more than quick victories. Not bad for a retirement plan that wasn't really retirement at all. William Marshal's tomb lists his battles and titles, but his real legacy was a piece of parchment nobody talks about anymore. Not Magna Carta, the other one. In 1217, as regent for Henry III, he pushed through a revised version called the Charter of the Forest. It didn't have dramatic clauses about trial by jury or taxing consent. Instead, it protected commoners' rights to gather firewood, graze pigs, and survive off royal lands. Doesn't sound exciting until you realize this was medieval welfare reform. The original Forest Charter barely survived the politics of Henry's minority. Rebel barons wanted radical land reforms. The Pope's representatives worried it undermined royal authority. Even Marshal's allies thought it wasn't worth the fight. Forest law was brutal. Getting caught hunting deer could mean losing a hand or worse. But the forests were also economic lifelines for peasants who needed firewood and pasture. Marshal, of all people, understood survival economics better than most. He approached this like a tournament strategy. First, he linked the Forest Charter to the reissued Magna Carta, making them a package deal. Then he granted exceptions to powerful nobles whose support he needed. Finally, he let the papal legate claim credit for moderating the reforms. The final version was full of loopholes, but the core held. Commoners kept access to royal forests. Most regents focused on big constitutional issues. Marshal spent political capital letting peasants collect acorns. It wasn't charity. Stable peasants meant steady tax revenue and fewer rebellions. Other European monarchs were drowning in peasant revolts. England avoided major uprisings for generations because commoners had just enough to lose. The Forest Charter was crisis management disguised as reform. The financial details show his pragmatism. Royal forests covered about 25% of England. Earlier kings fined villagers for gathering wood or hunting game. Marshal's charter reduced fees and banned eye-gouging punishments. It wasn't generosity, it was cost-benefit analysis. Tracking down every peasant stealing firewood required more administrators than it was worth. Better to legalize minor uses and focus enforcement on major poachers. Implementation was tougher. Local sheriffs hated losing bribe income from false charges. Some barons ignored the rules, assuming a child king couldn't enforce them. Marshal did something clever. He appointed special justices to handle forest complaints directly. These weren't bureaucrats but combat veterans who'd served under him. They understood two things: the charter's limits and how to motivate compliance. Fines replaced mutilation, but repeat offenders still faced harsh penalties. The long-term effects were bigger than anyone expected. Protected forest access eased famine impacts during bad harvests. Villagers could heat homes without risking dismemberment. Small landowners survived economic downturns by supplementing with forest resources. Over decades, these small stabilizers prevented the desperation that fueled revolts elsewhere in Europe. Marshal never lived to see the full impact. He died in 1219, 2 years after the charter passed. But his successors kept the system largely intact because it worked. When Henry III took full control in 1227, he confirmed the Forest Charter himself. Later kings renewed it repeatedly, not out of kindness, but because stable peasants paid taxes and didn't torch castles. The administrative side was pure martial. He established forest courts with set fines instead of arbitrary punishments. He created appeal processes to prevent local corruption. These weren't rights in the modern sense, more like standardized rules everyone could predict. Surprise fines anger people. Published rate sheets they tolerate. Comparisons to other countries show the difference. In France, forest laws stayed harsh until the Revolution. German peasants regularly revolted against hunting restrictions. England's relative stability owed much to this unglamorous reform. Even during crises like the Barons' War, commoners mostly stayed out because the charter gave them stakes in the system. Marshal's role got erased over time. Later historians focused on Magna Carta's grand principles, not the Forest Charter's practical fixes. But the evidence survives in manor records. Villages near Royal would show fewer famine deaths after 1217. Court rolls list forest fines replacing mutilation sentences. Even the landscape changed. Carefully managed coppicing replaced illegal clearcutting as peasants worked within the rules. The real genius was making bureaucracy boring. Exciting reforms get overturned when passions cool. Marshal's forest system was just dull enough to last. Sheriffs found it easier to follow the new rules than fight them. Peasants learned the fee schedules like tax codes. Nobody wrote ballads about firewood regulations, which was exactly why they endured. Modern statutes cite Magna Carta constantly. The Forest Charter barely gets footnotes. But walk through any former royal woodland in England today, and you'll see its legacy: carefully managed thickets that fed families for generations, not just hunting preserves for nobles. That was Marshal's real gift. Not some romantic ideal of justice, but the understanding that people fight less when they can heat their homes and feed their pigs. The greatest knight in England secured his legacy not with a sword, but with a logging permit. His tomb shows a warrior, but history might better remember him as the man who decided peasants needed reliable access to kindling. It's not glamorous, but neither was survival. The Forest Charter worked because it treated governance like Marshal treated everything else, as a practical problem requiring flexible solutions. 7 centuries later, that lesson still holds. The flashy reforms get remembered. The quiet ones keep the lights on. William Marshal proved you can win the long game without playing by the rules. A hostage kid who wasn't supposed to survive became England's power behind the throne. He served 5 kings, outlasted countless enemies, and died peacefully in bed at 72, medieval retirement goals. The lesson isn't about brute strength. It's about reading the room better than anyone else. Marshal knew when to bow, when to fight, and when to disappear until the storm passed. Next time life feels like a rigged system, remember the landless knight who changed England's rules without ever breaking them. Some stories sleep for centuries but never really die. Sweet dreams, history fans.